Today, we are doing a Bissel of modern Judaism. We're starting with what was Jewish emancipation and moving forward through why does Reform Judaism exist, and touching briefly on the way in which the revolution of Reform Judaism led to other movements in Judaism. So our agenda today, I'm going to start by explaining rationalism and Jewish emancipation. And then we're going to take a break from me explaining things to talk about what we know as a group about the origins of Reform Judaism. Then have a little bit about the first Reform congregation in Germany, the stages of Reform Judaism, and then a little bit about HUC and the World Union for Progressive Judaism, some excerpts from the Pittsburgh Principles from 1999. So that's not the original American platform was written in Pittsburgh, and then the most recent principles were also written in Pittsburgh, and then a slide of resources. Okay, as with every class, remember you can interrupt me at any time. Hopefully this won't be as, well, I think that the first part is going to be a little bit strange because it was very strange to me when I originally learned it. So please feel free to interrupt me at any time. So the first thing before we start reading is, before we get to the Age of Enlightenment, you should know that there was a reason that emancipation was needed, particularly for Jews. So most of us are familiar with that in the medieval period, they had a feudal system, and there were serfs, and there were nobility, there were knights. That's generally the only parts of society that we're told about in most history classes. I say that as someone who took a lot of AP history. I took AP European history in high school. I took history in college. That's all that I knew about the stratification of people in the medieval Europe. There was another class of people, and that were Jews, because we were not even serfs. We were not considered as part of any location that we lived in. We were chattel of the nobility that lived there. And at any point in time, the nobility could choose to tell us that we could no longer live there, and that is the main reason that Jews migrated during the Middle Ages, is that they were forced to move from place to place. Okay, so going to the Age of Enlightenment, Jewish emancipation could not have happened without the rise of rationalism. Rationalism subverted the Christian tradition that saw oppressing Jews as being divinely ordained. Rationalism also posited that racial prejudice of any kind was unsustainable scientifically, and any concept of racial superiority was to be rejected as unscientific. By their own theories, rationalists had to support Jewish emancipation. At the same time, rationalists saw Judaism as hopelessly barbaric and harmful. Beginning with Voltaire, they began to transfer that hostility onto Jews as a whole. This is another thing I had no idea about until my beloved professor, Dr. Bob Levy, Zichrono Livracha, explained it to me. That many of the European philosophers that we all see as part of our cultural history were also extremely anti-Jewish, including Voltaire. Yes, Shari.
So the rationalists were not Jewish per se, correct?
Absolutely.
Okay, this was not Jewish theory. This was something that was happening in the broader world.
Yeah, this is these are Christians by and large who are the rationalists, yeah. So Voltaire being one of them, and the best known of them, and it's rationalism, and which is a form of philosophy that really helped to break people free of the confines of the church, and the way that the church would bring down scientific discovery the way that Galileo was persecuted for claiming that the earth revolved around the sun. So the rationalists were really important for allowing humanity, particularly Christian Europe, to understand that scientific knowledge was important and a basis for society to move forward. And the Age of Enlightenment is what led to the Industrial Revolution. So the progress that has been made in modernity is because of these new ways of seeing the world. So the French Revolution was a big thing. And all these contradictions would arise when rationalism triumphed with the French Revolution in 1789, which abolished the feudal order that went back 10 centuries in one fell swoop. When revolutionaries issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man, it stated, "All men are born and remain free and equal in rights. No person shall be molested for his opinions, even such as are religious." So Jews thought that they would be included, especially since Protestants were included in this Declaration of Man. There was no longer a lower level of communal understanding for Protestants in the majority Catholic France. So this revolution attacked three pillars of power: the monarchy, the Catholic Church, and the aristocracy. At the time, French Jews were 40,000 out of 25 million people in France. So Alsace-Lorraine is like sort of like an eyebrow-shaped part of France that butts up against Germany. Tensions between peasants and Jews actually intensified because of the revolution. Peasants saw the revolution as a chance to free themselves from the debts they owed Jews. Outbreaks of violence against Jews took place in 20 Jewish communities in Alsace in 1789. The tension would only escalate when the government started auctioning off the estates of the Catholic Church and nobles, which owned vast swaths of land. 400,000 peasants were in hock to Jews. In some parts of Alsace, up to half the money owed by the rural population was owed to Jews. Consequently, when Jewish civil equality was brought up at the new National Assembly in Paris, the matter was quickly shelved because of the arguments from Alsace-Lorraine. Now, the Sephardic emancipation came before the Ashkenazic in France. Those considered friendly to Jews argued Jews should be given a chance to reform themselves, or they made legal arguments about the inconsistency about abolishing feudalism and keeping Jews in feudal isolation. Opponents to Jewish emancipation insisted Jews by their very nature would never change, nor would they want to change. Judaism held that Jews were a separate nation. It is not I that exclude the Jews, they exclude themselves. Hence, many called for Jews to be named resident foreigners, not citizens. Opposition to emancipating the Sephardic Jews of Bordeaux was less adamant, and they were granted civil equality first and separately. In late 1791, after bitter, acrimonious debate and a very close vote, Ashkenazi Jews were granted citizenship. They voted yes, less out of sympathy for the Jews, rather that it would be inconsistent with revolutionary ideas to exclude them. They did so out of the belief that Jews deserved equality only if they used that equality to change. It's really important to note that it's not just Jews who were calling for Jews to stop separating themselves, stop acting so Jewish, but that it was a big pressure from the broader cultures that if you really want to integrate with us, you should stop being so Jewish. There was a lot of misunderstanding about what Judaism was, and a lot of thinking that just that the that Judaism itself stopped becoming new with the Hebrew Bible, and a lot of misunderstanding about what the Talmud was. The Talmud was burned so many times that we don't have a complete volume of the Talmud until the Middle Ages, and very few of them. Okay, so in Germany, Jews were peddlers, criminals, or beggars at the beginning of the 1800s. As late as 1820, almost all German Jews and no less than 96% of Jews in Bavaria were still employed as peddlers or small shopkeepers. By the mid-19th century, Jews accounted for nearly 1/5 of German economic activity, even though they made up only 1% of the population. According to tax records that probably underestimated the actual situation, over 60% of all Prussian Jews were of secure middle-class status by 1870. The rise of German Jews was perhaps the fastest and greatest leap that any minority has ever experienced in modern European history. Jews became the most upwardly mobile group in all of Germany, as they were in Austria, Hungary, and many cities of Western Europe. So emancipation beyond France happened because of Napoleon, to begin with. Napoleon enacted emancipation while conquering Europe, along with the infamous decree of 1808, limiting Jewish money lending and commerce for 10 years. He was defeated in 1815. So emancipation came in Central Europe between 1867 and 1871, in Austria-Hungary in 1867, Prussia in 1869, Italy in 1870. The rest of Germany, remember, it wasn't one country at the time, was 1871, and Britain in 1858. Only 2 countries remained that refused to emancipate their Jewish communities, Russia and Romania. And this could only have happened in a capitalist society. So integrating into society, the Jews' commercial success and their conspicuous social mobility was, needless to say, cause of much resentment and animosity in the 19th century. That's the 1800s. But actually, any scandal over the Jews staying stuck in commerce paled in comparison to the uproar to the Jews not staying stuck in commerce. For it was not their business practices, it was their startling transformation as urban professionals, just as Moses Mendelssohn predicted, that most scandalized Europe. They made sure their kids didn't stay in poverty. In large numbers, Western and Central European Jews shunned the traditional cheder and went to secular schools. Going to secondary schools, getting a secular education became a Jewish obsession. More Jews embraced Reform Judaism, which they considered a halfway house towards enlightened Christianity. Many would acknowledge they came from an old and ancient Jewish tradition, but they felt it had precious little to offer them in comparison to the overwhelming European theater, arts, literature, and philosophy. Who would pick the Talmud over Pushkin? For them, it was clear as day that the Jews were no longer a separate nation and that Jewish nationhood had ceased 2,000 years ago. Gabriel Reiser remarked that any Jew who continued to identify with such a dead Jewish nation over a German one should immediately be placed under police protection, not because he was dangerous, but because he was insane. So Gabriel Reiser is an interesting person from Prussian history. His grandfathers, both of them, were rabbis, and he and his father went into commerce. He as soon as he was able to, and they both pushed the barriers for Jews to be accepted into mainstream German society. And he actually became a politician and was elected to different city councils where he lived. But he was at the foreground of integrating Jews into German society. So now that we have all that under our belts, so we discussed briefly that Reform Judaism started in Germany. Did you know about the fight for emancipation before today? And what can you share about the origins of Reform Judaism? And then the other questions are after that, they're kind of in two parts. So so just reflecting back on the information I just shared and what your thoughts before today were on the origins of Reform Judaism. If anyone wants to speak up, because I don't want it to just be a lecture. I know it's like shocking information.
Well, you know, it makes sense that that kind of modernization and the, you know, I never really thought of the connection between the French Revolution and equality and Jews becoming more integrated into general society. I never made those connections, but it makes complete sense.
Yeah. It's so weird. It reminds me of how unusual it was for me before going to seminary to know anything about Jews in really before 1900, and that, you know, when I found a historical novel that included a Jewish character, that made it much more intriguing to me. But yeah, I knew a lot about how much death was involved in the French Revolution, and how even the revolutionaries themselves, some of them were killed, but not about what it meant for Jews, and also not about like why Jews liked Napoleon so much. Okay, so
it's also interesting that the Russian, you know, in Russia, because it was in a capitalist society, they never embraced that the reforms, and that's where a lot of our ancestors hailed from.
Right. Yeah. And the amount of persecution of Jews over and over again in Russian territory.
Also, what I find interesting.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you, Jackie.
What I said is it's interesting that they don't ever talk about China, Japan, the Far East when they talk about Jews' emancipation. There were no Jews in China at that time.
So this is about European
Did you hear
history.
Me?
I hear you. This is about European history.
Oh, European. Okay. All right.
Yeah. Jews
Okay.
were the majority of Jews who were not in Europe were in the Middle East. They were not emancipated. They were completely not emancipated. There were no Jews in Japan. There was a small community in China, and there is a population in India as well. I don't know the history of the Indian Jewish population, other than it is it's a very long-standing one. But in the Middle East, they're part of the interesting thing is that the number of Jews in the Middle East was kept down throughout history because of the discrimination that they encountered, and the population of Jews in Europe ebbed and flowed, sort of based on how much they were being persecuted. So, and then also being able to come to the United States is earlier, in larger, or not earlier, because the first Jews in America were Sephardic, but the people that came to the United States also increased the population of Jews. And so now in modern times, there, but simply by numbers, there are more Ashkenazi Jews than other distinct ethnicities of Jews, but then that too is being transformed, and there are more Jews are of a variety of ethnic backgrounds, not necessarily because of historical Jewish roots, but because of intermarriage, that these kind of distinctions are less and less prominent in how people understand their own identities.
I'm a little confused about something. So the Pale settlement was really split between the being under the Tsar, and I believe some of it was in Austria, the Austria-Hungarian Empire. So were they emancipated? Well, I thought they were always in the same boat.
So
the ones under the Tsar.
The Pale settlement itself is a construction of the Russian Empire. So that would be part of Russia and not emancipated, and was actually the place that a lot of the persecution happened.
Right, but I thought at some point some of them were under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but that was
it is a shifting area. The larger part geography is shifting, and there were people that lived in the Polish kingdom that then became Russia, and vice versa, and Austria, also the Austria-Hungarian Empire. But so I think it just depends on what city you're talking about.
Right. Okay.
But but in later history, in terms of the tax, and then the forced Russia forced Jewish men into their army, and then they started conscripting boys. So they took almost all of the male population of a lot of small Jewish towns, and were trying to forcibly convert them into Christianity, or as part of their service in the army. So it was a really devastating process for Jews in that region.
I think that's why a lot of them left, like my ancestors. That's why they came to the United States.
Exactly, mine too.
Yeah.
Okay, so looking forward, because the next part of our conversation is going to be about Reform Judaism specifically. I'm curious if there's a tension between the particularism of Judaism and universalism, and the balance between identifying ourselves as a particular religion or a particular community with a history and a purpose unto ourselves, versus sharing with the world the ideals of ethical monotheism and the prophetic voice for social justice. So I am wondering if anyone has any thoughts about the balance between those things. And how that interacts with your own relationship to Judaism. Or is that just like something that you never think about?
I was under the impression that originally the Reform Judaism was pretty had a negative view of the halakha, probably more than today.
Absolutely.
I don't know if that's true. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was like trying to shed all that.
Right. Absolutely. And it's part of like integrating Enlightenment theory into their practice, that what is the rational basis for halakha? it's not on a continuum of rational, irrational. So in order to accept it, you have to place yourself beyond or aside from the rationalist world around you.
It's Carol. I know when I was growing up, and I lived in several different places, and most of them had Jewish neighborhoods that I went to. It wasn't until Temple City many years later. However, I always felt internally, even though my family wasn't following Jewish holidays and whatnot, I always felt like I was Jewish. I had this inside me. I don't know where it came from. Maybe it was an identity I was looking for as a young person or something like that, that it just, I didn't think about other ethnicities and Christian and whatnot. And it wasn't until, obviously going to Temple Beth David, or even when I started to date Joe, who knows a lot, knows some about, history of Judaism and all that, that I really began to know about what the Orthodox really was. I'd seen them, but it was like a foreign thing, more or less. Like when you hear about Arlene, who lived right across the street from, so she obviously had this introduction. So unless you lived in an area like that, it was almost like, who are these people? Why are we the same but different? And all that. And I just thought that the reform movement was Judaism. So it just kind of is like great that we know that there were other ways to do this, but the Reform Judaism really fell into place, at least in my lifestyle. So that's where I'm coming from today with this, and anything I learned from before just adds to the fact.
Do you think that being brought up Reformed doesn't teach you this? I mean, growing up conservative, I immediately knew that there were 3 branches of Judaism. Do we not teach that, Reb?
This is Doris. I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
Yeah, absolutely.
When I went to Beth David went to school. Jackie,
Oh, you're breaking up.
Jackie, can you have 2 devices? Can you mute one of them?
I don't have 2 on.
It says
have
you do.
2. You're listed twice.
But Doris, you muted yourself, so we can't hear you anymore. Just as
Aren't
an
both
FYI.
of them muted? Aren't they both muted?
I'm sorry, they're both muted, but you have sound probably coming out, and that's why you're getting the feedback.
Are they close to each other, your 2 devices? Well, I'm gonna, because they led into
Not now. They're not near each other.
Okay. This is Carol again, really quick, because they just started with, I did know about the 3 different parts of Judaism, but it wasn't later till, because I think I attended Sunday school for a year or 2. And so, but I didn't know there were 3 different branches, but that, yes, I knew the outside of it, but not the inside. Not that that matters to anyone, but that's my.
No, I mean, I find it really fascinating because, even when I was growing up, yes, I didn't know anything about emancipation. I didn't know anything about Jewish history. But I did know about the 3 branches. And it was to me, there's something about movement Judaism that is very particular about not just explaining to you what the Judaism is that we practice, but also why we're better than the other ones. And I don't know if anyone else experienced that.
I remember hearing a lot about how Reform was kind of Jewish. Let's just say that the Reform movement was not given a lot of credibility in my growing up. I grew up conservative, and it was like the Reforms over there. Yeah, they just they kind of want.
Yeah, And Chabad will say, you're not Jewish. They may say it to my husband, but they won't say it to me.
Yeah.
And that's just their way. I just take it with, you're into the way that you were taught, and I appreciate that they follow Judaism to the T, if you would, but that's not necessarily how I was brought up. And I think just as a community that we all have this integral part inside of where we have this Jewish culture inside us. You can't erase it. You can't take it away. And depending, you don't have to do anything, but you could be Jewish in even just your thoughts. And
Amen.
that's the best part, I think. Nobody tells you that you must follow this, this, and this, but it's there if you want it.
Right.
I remember going to Temple Manual in Beverly Hills as a child and thinking, this is like a church. They had a choir, they had an organ, and it was a real turnoff to me coming from Mogan David to go there and see that this wasn't Judaism. What are they doing here? As a kid, I saw that, and it just had a big impression on me.
Was Mogan David?
With Temple Emmanuel, which was Reformed.
Right.
That it was more like a church to me.
The synagogue you grew up at, was it conservative or Orthodox?
Conservative. Mogan David, conservative.
Yeah.
I grew up, and the differentiation was not by Reform, conservative. Nobody ever used those names when I grew up in New York. It was more or less religious. So I don't have any training. I never went to Hebrew school, but my parents said, we're not religious. Where the grandmothers, the grandparents were more religious. And then the great grandmothers lived also with a family. They were very religious. And the people that, what we would call the ultra-Orthodox now, if we saw them in Brooklyn, where I grew up, those people were very, very religious. But that was the only word that we ever used in our family.
And I so appreciate that you brought that up, because that is what I struggle against. I really reject the idea that that only halachic Judaism is very religious, because I believe so strongly in the community that you all have built here. I believe so strongly in using the wisdom of Judaism, regardless of your connection or disconnection from halakha. And that is a deeply religious experience.
So a lot of it, I guess, was at that time semantics, and that's what people said. I don't even think my parents knew that there were those distinctions. You knew that there were certain synagogues in White Plains, New York. This one they call Reform, this one they call Reconstructionist, or, oh, that one is the Orthodox. But we didn't know what that means. It was just part of the name, essentially.
Oh, interesting.
I grew up in a secular Jewish home, and I went to 10 years of secular Jewish education. So I never stepped inside a synagogue till I was in my 40s, but I had a very deep and rich Jewish experience, but it was not religious. So I think that's the reason that Judaism has survived all these years. How did we survive when all these other religions didn't and all these other people didn't? Because we could adjust. And as the world changed, we were able to change. I think the ultra-Orthodox or the super-Orthodox or the real Jews, as they like to probably call themselves, they teach us what the original traditions were there for. The rules, they're based in what worked for them then. But I think because we have been able to move forward, we have been able to adjust, we've survived. And I think the world does not allow us to not be Jews, which is why we're also still Jews, because many people did leave Judaism. You know that. I mean, it's amazing now that people who are doing their DNA are finding that their ancestors are Jews. Look at Marilyn Albright, you know, she didn't even know her family was Jewish, but real Jews, right? And many Jews left Judaism. And if we hadn't been able to change, become Reform, be secular Jews, whatever, intermarry, interfaith, we probably would not have survived. I think that's part of our resiliency. But we can't impose, I mean, the Haredi can't impose their will on us, and we can't impose our will on them. But, you know, it's upsetting when, like in Israel, when you have only the Jews are the religious Jews and the Reform Jews are not, that's going to have to change.
Right.
Because it's too rigid and we can't hold to that rigidity or we won't survive.
Right.
And I think the key word is resilience.
Mhm.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think what Robin was saying is I totally agree. And I know, like, I remember my mom saying when her grandfather was alive and they did Passover and whatnot, but as soon as the great grandparents or whatever, to me, Joe, can you turn that off, please? Thank you. We're gone. They're like, okay, we don't need this anymore. We're trying to blend into a country here. We're trying to become like the others. We don't, sometimes it was like, don't draw attention. And then there were the stories of the ones coming over on the ship with, you know, the I'll just make it up, or however, you know, the son would be like, oh, you don't need these Shabbat candles anymore, and threw them overboard. I mean, drastic, you know, things that would lead comfort to somebody, but it's like, we're starting a new life. We're not going to go on with this. I mean, that's just one small part of the scenario of how people came over and adjusted or wanted to fit in. But on the other hand, we have, like Robin says, the ones that have adjusted have made it into their life, so we can live it how we want it. And very fortunate that we can change it in a way to satisfy a greater number of people. And like Robin said, I think that it still is evolving and we do have a way to go, but we have to keep, we need to keep ourselves open and up and out there, so that people that would not know until they do the DNA and become like, oh my goodness, I want to check this out. You know, there are those type of people, you know, and have them join in the Jewish religion, whatever's comfortable to them.
Right. You know, it's interesting, Carol, that you said it that way, because we do have this connection to people who, because they search out Judaism because of their tangible DNA ethnic roots, that oh, of course their soul is coming home. And yet I've also seen that with people without any ethnic connection to Judaism, that being opened up to the way that Judaism frames our connection to one another, to the world, and to the divine, speaks to people profoundly and answers a lot of questions for people who struggle to live within other systems of relationship with those three things. So yeah, I really love holding space for people that come home to their souls in Judaism. But it is that interesting tension of, is Judaism an ethnicity, a religion? Is it both? Or is it only one or the other? And I think that it's hard to, I think even as we become more multicultural as a Jewish people, recognizing the ways in which both those things have allowed us to continue through the generations is important to me.
Yeah, I realize now with, as in yourself, not to just because you're here with inter-ethnic marriage, how that plays out. I mean, do you bring up, I mean, for me, we never grew up with anything Christmas. And Joe and I, hey, if there's a Christmas party, we're there. I don't do it. I don't miss it, you know. And, you know, and what is the next generation going to be doing about this? There will still be Hanukkah celebrations, but there will also be, you know, Christmas and Hanukkah. And I think that for a lot of people, that this is something that for someone like me, I'll just be, okay, if that's what you want, you know, I'm not going to be all crabby about it. And it's not my decision, but I think that they embrace what they want from Judaism, and they live it, and it's there, and it's just depending on your lifestyle and what fits you best.
Right. I think that
I'm sorry. This is Doris, and I'm not sure I'm getting in because I keep dropping in and out. Can you hear me?
yes.
Thank you. I just wanted to say, and I'm sorry I came in so late. I kept trying to get in and it would drop out, and I might drop out at any minute. Anyway, I was raised here in Temple City, and I went to Temple Beth David from the very beginning when I was just a little kid, and went to the religious school in the classrooms there. And what I was going to say was my parents came from mainly Chicago, and
I was so looking forward to your Chicago connection. I think Doris just dropped out again. When she comes back, I do look forward to hearing about her family history. Shari, you had your hand raised.
Yeah. You said earlier, you know, about whether it's a religion or a nationality, and, you know, kind of think back of, you know, if you were English in, you know, in the era of Henry VIII, you know, you'd be Church of England. And if you were French, you know, you were Catholic. So, you know, the whole idea of nationality and religion being different aspects, you know, most people were all of one, and it was never a question. It's only, you know, I think it's only really a question in the modern world. And maybe for Jews, it's more of an issue because we haven't had a land, but, you know, where, you know, in many cultures, your nationality and your religion are all one. And I'm going to mute with all this noise in the background. I'm sorry.
It's all good.
please,
So
please forgive me for a moment. I don't know if you can hear.
oh dear, I think she dropped out again. So the idea of nationality is a modern invention because the nation state didn't exist in the form that we understand it as nationality. And there were definitely divisions within like British society. Yes, there was the Church of England, but there was, before the Church of England was the Catholic Church. And there were part of the reason that they kept having wars between themselves was because of that tension. And so there's that piece of it. We were never considered part of our host communities. We weren't part of the feudal system. And so we were always considered other. So we were always a grouping of people and religious thing. Now we also did that ourselves. From the beginning of Judaism, we have thought of ourselves as a people with religious practices. That is a much more traditional way of understanding peoplehood. And it was only Christianity itself created the term religion in order to separate people from their personal peoplehood identity and their beliefs. And it also made belief as the linchpin of what you think of as religion, because in that way they were able to convert more people into Christianity. So they were able to push aside more indigenous beliefs, which they would call pagan, and either nicely or forcibly convert people into Christianity. So there we were, that peoplehood difference is different than whether or not we had a nation state. We always prayed about ourselves as Israel. So there was this, our peoplehood was named as part of a location that we came from. But we also recognized ourselves as, the diaspora after the Roman conquering of Israel.
But it was almost like we were Jewish. It wasn't like we believed in Judaism. We were Jewish.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and that's the most fascinating part, that we have so few records of everyday Jews, the same way that Robin was talking about, you didn't have to do Jewish in order to be Jewish throughout the ages. I really believe strongly that we had a lot of Jews who supported, supported the rabbis in the ongoing knowledge creation part of Judaism and ritual practice, but they themselves were merchants who traveled and worked on Shabbos, and that was fine. There was no denigration of the merchants. They were the ones that were supporting everyone. The other interesting thing to remember about Jewish life is how much tzedakah is mandatory. And so part of what kept us going as a group of people is that everyone gave money in order to ensure that the collective whole survived. And that kind of communal connectedness was unheard of in other communities. So if, Doris, are you back with us? Did you want to tell us about your parents coming from Chicago? Okay, so I'm going to go on to my slides about the creation of Reform. Oh yeah.
I'm sorry. My parents told my sister and me that you could be Orthodox, Reform, whatever, wherever you were, and be okay about that. And the only religious school and temple that I went to has been Temple of David all this time.
I'm so sorry, I can't hear you anymore.
Doris, I think you muted yourself.
I think she was trying to put on her video and she accidentally muted herself. And she's dropped off. Okay, so hopefully she'll be able to come on and talk to us at the end. We'll have more time for discussion. So the first Reformed temple. Now this comes from a essay that Rabbi Lawrence Englander wrote that's on the Reformed Judaism website. The first Reformed temple opened its doors more than 200 years ago in the town of Seesen, Germany. At the inaugural ceremony on July 17, 1810, a parade of rabbis, Christian ministers, and political dignitaries passed under a chiming bell tower and entered the sanctuary, while an adult choir, accompanied by a pipe organ, sang hymns in German and Hebrew. The businessman and philanthropist who had founded this temple, Mr. Israel Jacobson, delivered the sermon while draped in a black clerical robe. Standing behind a pulpit at the front of the sanctuary, the man who had also established an egalitarian, religiously pluralistic boarding school for 40 Jewish and 20 Christian children told the august assembly, on all sides, enlightenment opens up new areas for religious development. Why should we Jews be left behind? I think this really speaks to the way in which it really was about integrating into German society and taking on things that were seen as more modern because they were Christian, in terms of ways of welcoming in people by using both the vernacular language and Hebrew in their prayers. And then also the using a choir and a pipe organ were things that were borrowed from the Christian tradition. So Rabbi Englander talks about 4 stages of Reform Judaism in his essay, and it begins with the emancipation. It begins with a phrase that starts from emancipation to the creation of the Jewish state. So that's a pretty long period of time. So the German beginnings that we just spoke about, they did abandon codes of diet, dress, and ritual practices. It's an interesting way of formulating that, which is all to say they no longer saw halacha as the binding principles of Jewish life. They declared that the mission of Israel is the Jews' historic task to bring social justice to the world from within the lands where they lived. So in other words, that instead of aspiring to a Jewish future, they aspire to a universal future where we have social justice in our homes. Why would we, the Reformed Jews were anti-Zionist at the beginning of modern Zionism. Why would we bother to go to a swampy Middle Eastern land when we have high culture and modern amenities here in Europe? So this changed from the Six-Day War. Completely changed all of Reform Judaism's perspective on Israel and Zionism, and then that stage of Judaism continued until through the saving of Soviet Jewry. So in the 1960s, there was ethnic pride was a strong thing in the zeitgeist in America, especially. So there was, Black pride, and Indigenous Americans were speaking about themselves. And so many Jews came back to acknowledging their Jewishness from an ethnic basis. Yes, Linda. I can't hear you.
I didn't have my hand up.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so then at this time, Jews became very involved in and active in the civil rights movement. Many younger Jews, especially, were part of the going into the American South on freedom rides, and also the feminist movement. We don't always acknowledge the really amazing Jewish women who were involved in the second wave feminism, both Betty Friedan and Bella Abzug in particular. And then there was also the creation of the Jewish Catalog, which taught people how to do Judaism for themselves. And it started this back to tradition movement, which was not just about, which really inspired a lot of people, including a lot of Reform Jews, to take on and play with and use ritual Judaism in order to do Jewish in a more meaningful way for themselves. So then the period that we tend to think back of, and we tend to expect it to be as it is now, is the innovation and interfaith time frame, which is the time frames between the third and fourth stages are a bit more amorphous, but I believe that it's really from the 80s and 90s and maybe the early 2000s in the third stage, and then the paradoxical state is what we're in now. So in the third stage, there was interfaith dialogue. This was when there was a CCAR, which is the Council of American Rabbis, which is the Reformed Jewish the Reform Rabbis Network made a resolution declaring that people of patrilineal descent, so people whose fathers were Jewish, are Jewish as long as they identify as Jewish and incorporate Judaism into their lives, usually through education. So this is also the time that new melodies for communal singing became part of Reform Judaism. So prior to this, there was some more, as some people described attending Reform Jewish services, it was much more Protestant looking. So in another way of defining the eras of Reform Judaism is that was the era of high reform, when you would have choirs and organs, and the cantor would do solo singing, and then with Debbie Friedman and with some other well-known musicians, they really brought the era of communal singing into Reform spaces. There was also an emphasis on the inner journey and using Eastern modalities like meditation and yoga. And then beginning in the 90s, there was a decreasing affiliation among young people. I found it really fascinating that Rabbi Englander notes that trend started in the 90s, and that in some ways doesn't seem that long ago, but that was 30 years ago. So it's a little shocking to me to think about it that way, that 1990 was that long ago, but there you go. So, and then now we're in this paradoxical state of fractionalized identity. So people don't just identify as Jewish and American, or that we have identities based on our. This part I don't fully agree with him about, but he noted that socioeconomic class comes into play more nowadays, and what we do for a living and all of these things. And also our political identities tends to be a bit higher on the scale. I just think that these identities always existed, but there was a push towards conformity more in the past. So we Jews tend to use Jewish communal spaces for services rather than to build community. And our connection to Israel is less straightforward than it was from the Six-Day War through the 90s, in terms of the fact that Reform Jews recognize that just as we can question the decisions of the American government, we can question the decisions of the Israeli government, particularly around religious pluralism and also other things that they do. Although, so I'll just leave it there. So the first American Jewish seminary, it really was the first seminary in America, was Hebrew Union College. It was founded in Cincinnati in 1875. A really interesting thing about this is that the number of students who are choosing to attend HUC in Cincinnati has decreased so much over the years that there was a recommendation to close the Rabbinical School in Cincinnati, and at their founders' lecture, one of their speakers gave a passionate speech in support of continuing rabbinic education in Cincinnati, and that the foundations of Reform Judaism should never be lost, and it should never be based on financial concerns or a balance sheet. So in 1883, they had their first rabbinical graduates, and this is the infamous Treyfa Banquet, was in honoring their first rabbinical graduates. If you don't know about that banquet, they specifically served tray food. So they served shellfish, and they also served milk products right after the meat course. That banquet led to the creation of conservative Judaism as an alternative, as a balancing place between Reform Judaism and Orthodox Judaism. Now, Orthodox Judaism did not exist as a title at this time. It was just Judaism. But in any case, in 1950, HUC merged with the New York City seminary that was called Jewish Institute of Religion. And in 1954, the Los Angeles campus was added. And then in 1963, the Jerusalem campus was added. It's interesting to recognize for how long the Reform seminaries existed prior to them having the requirement of doing a year of rabbinical training in Israel. So in 1926, the British liberals, American Reform, and German liberals consolidated their worldwide movement, united in affirming tenets such as progressive revelation, supremacy of ethics above ritual, and so forth. At a meeting held in London, they named themselves the World Union for Progressive Judaism, and this World Union now includes Reconstructing Judaism as well. I find that a very interesting note. So this is these are some excerpts. The Pittsburgh Principles of 1999 are actually much longer than this. So it begins in the beginning part. It says, today, when so many individuals are striving for religious meaning, moral purpose, and a sense of community, we believe it is our obligation as rabbis, once again, to state a set of principles that define Reform Judaism in our own time. Regarding God, we affirm the reality and oneness of God, even as we may differ in our understanding of the divine presence. As a side note on this is actually part of why Jewish humanism exists, is that the first humanist rabbi wanted to be affiliated with Reform Judaism, and was told that his synagogue could not be affiliated, and hence Jewish humanism began. So Torah, we affirm that Torah is the foundation of Jewish life. Through Torah, through Torah study, we are called to mitzvot, means by which we make our lives holy. Regarding Israel, we are Israel, a people aspiring to holiness, singled out through our ancient covenant and our unique history among the nations to be witnesses to God's presence. We are linked by that covenant and that history to all Jews in every age and place. So there are more points under each of these three categories, but this is the reason that on the Reform Judaism website, you will see reference to the fact that the pillars of Reform Judaism are God, Torah, and Israel.
But it's interesting that the way they describe Israel, they don't describe it as that particular geographical land.
Yes. So this is how it begins to describe Israel, and just as with the other categories, they have more. So let me read to you the thing about the land. But it is after many paragraphs about us as a people. We are committed to Medinat Yisrael, the state of Israel, and rejoice in its accomplishments. We affirm the unique qualities of living in Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, and encourage Aliyah, immigration to Israel. We are committed to a vision of the state of Israel that promotes full civil, human, and religious rights for all its inhabitants, and that strives for a lasting peace between Israel and its neighbors. We are committed to promoting and strengthening progressive Judaism in Israel, which will enrich the spiritual life of the Jewish state and its people. We affirm that both Israeli and diaspora Jewry should remain vibrant and interdependent communities, as we urge Jews who reside outside Israel to learn Hebrew as a living language and to make periodic visits to Israel in order to study and to deepen their relationship to the land and its people. So do we affirm that Israeli Jews have much to learn from the religious life of diaspora Jewry diaspora Jewish communities. And then and it sort of ends with, we are committed to furthering progressive Judaism throughout the world as a meaningful religious way of life for the Jewish people. So you can see that Israel is included. It's just not, it's not the primary focus of recognizing ourselves as Israel. So here are some resources for you. The History of Reform Judaism, where I got the 4 stages of Judaism from, is part of the reformjudaism.org website. The CCAR platforms are available on their website. Don't try to look up ccar.net. It is it's not ccar.org, it's ccarnet.org. I often make that mistake. And then I was reading the platform to you from, hold on, let me take off the blur so that you can see this. So this book is called A Vision of Holiness, The Future of Reform Judaism by Rabbi Richard Levy, Zichrono Livracha. He was, I realized that I didn't do that spotlight before. He was the past president of the Central Conference of American Rabbis. So that's what CCR stands for. And he was the director of the School of Rabbinic Studies at the Los Angeles campus of Hebrew Union College. And so he included at the beginning of his book the whole 1999 platform. At the end of his book, as appendix, are the other platforms, and then he goes through his vision of how to use this platform as a way of building a Jewish life. And then the other thing to know is most of you probably attended the adult education class where the executive director of the Jewish Federation of the San Gabriel and Pomona Valleys, Jason Moss, spoke about the current state of the Jewish community. There's you can watch it in a bit more detail, the ideas that he was presenting to Temple Beth David in a keynote speaker, Dr. Stephen Windmuller, and that speech is on YouTube, and it starts at the point that this at the point of this this link will take you exactly to when his speech starts, because the video itself is the entirety of their annual meeting. So it was starting with thanking their past board members, bringing in their new board members, that kind of stuff. But then he gives a keynote speech, and then he has a conversation with Jason Moss. So
can you copy those links in, or at least that YouTube link into the chat?
Yes.
Or maybe
I'm going to stop share so that I can do that. Because if I tried to do that before, and it was just clicking through to the next slide. So, right. Okay. So I had to take it out of presenting mode in order to be able to copy that for you. And let me get to chat. So here is the link to the video of that speech, because it's really an amazing, state of Judaism kind of speech. And he's done a lot of, he has throughout his career done a lot of work looking at Jewish communal life, but he's been particularly researching life in how those trends have become even more strengthened in COVID times. So that is that. And then this is the link for the area of the Reform Judaism site that has the history and whatnot. And then this is the name of the book. I find it I find it interesting to see how the history of Reform Judaism and the present state that people find themselves in have sort of merged. Now, the other thing you should know, I spoke about how the Treyfa Banquet led to the creation of conservative Judaism. It wasn't that it was known as conservative Judaism. They started their own seminary, the Jewish Theological Seminary, and eventually they came up with their name. They have a lot, conservative Judaism has a lot of intellectual like theory behind what they do. And they really are, on a rabbinic level, have a ton of responsa to halacha. They really try to hold this space that is both modern and traditional, that they are moving it forward at a faster pace than Orthodox Judaism. And became egalitarian sooner and all this kind of stuff. At the same time, all of that is sort of at the elite level. Especially, it's not just on the West Coast that people who went to conservative shuls chose those shuls because they were comfortable with the prayer services. So it was people who came from the old country. They knew that their prayers were in Hebrew. So they wanted to go someplace where the prayers were going to be in Hebrew. And it didn't necessarily mean that the people that attended conservative synagogues were halachically oriented Jews. It was more that they liked the Hamish nature of it. And Hamish was actually a pretty important part of it because there was a socioeconomic difference between German Jewish Americans and Ashkenazi Americans. I know Eastern European Ashkenazi Americans, that those of us who have those kind of ancestors came over poor and perhaps at a later date than German Jews. And so that level of difference also made a divide in how you were, which synagogue you were going to orient towards. So it's a really, and obviously that's not all over the, all of Judaism contains multitudes, but I think it's interesting that class difference is something that we shy away from recognizing as a reason that people chose different synagogues. And it's not an invention of America. People did it throughout our history. It's the reason that shtibels existed. It's a Yiddish term for a small shul.
What was the Yiddish term for the small shul? I'm sorry, this is Carol.
It's okay. It's a shtibel.
Shtibel?
Mhm.
Okay, Yiddish word of the day. We belong to a shtibel in Temple City.
And I might be pronouncing it wrong.
Robin will let us know.
So, yeah.
No, it's right. It actually comes from the word shtub, and a shtub is like a room or a house, and a shtibel is a little house or a little room. And so people would meet in these homes, and there would be very small congregations, and they would be made up of the communities that they came from. And there were many, and there were.
That's how Beth David started.
Well,
sort of.
Yeah. So it's a shtibel is exactly right. That's your Yiddish lesson for the day.
And that is coming out of what you just said. When I said before that when I grew up, it was not reform, it was not denominational, it was more or less religious. Now, my parents were both first generation Americans. Their parents came from Russia and Eastern Europe. Do you think the fact that they were not, quote, religious subconsciously has to do with the fact that they were Americans, they could be successful, and their parents were poor, as you say, they all came over steerage to Ellis Island? Do you think somewhere there was that, well, we're Americans, so either we're not like them, or we don't have to be that way, or we have more opportunities, and the word religious sort of got mixed up with all that? So it was, well, when you just talked about socioeconomic, right, it just sort of
Yeah.
hit a chord.
Yeah, well, I think it's also related to what Robin's been talking about, because we have, in addition to the trends of religious separations happening in modernity, there's always been this strong Jewish cultural thing, starting with especially with the Haskalah, which was the Jewish Enlightenment, about recognizing Jewish culture separate from Jewish religion, and that you can be Jewish without having to do those weird religious things. So I don't even know that it's. I think that it was a very strong distinction mark being made, and that people saw that as part of how you could be upwardly mobile, but even less than integrating with another society, because it's amazing how many Yiddish schools there were, and just deeply Jewish things that were happening that had nothing to do with religion. There was the clear cultural identity happening, and it was in support of something new, and a new way of being Jewish. So yeah.
Oops. Yeah, I wanted to just comment that, remember, it takes a lot of support to have a religious institution. And these people left their communities and came to America, and they were poor and they were hungry, and they had to go to work and make a life for themselves, because if they didn't work, they didn't eat. And in the old country, even if you were poor, you had a community that was established, and that could support a religious institution. If you didn't work on Shabbos, if you didn't, they tried to stay true to their kosher laws and their way of being. But if you had to work on Shabbos, you worked on Shabbos, and you worked and you lived in this society. And it was amazing how fast they were able to progress because they worked so hard. But one thing I wanted to mention too, that really was successful about being Jewish as opposed to not being Jewish, is our commitment to education for the boys especially. 98% of the boys of every Jewish community could read. And that meant they sent them to Cheder, they sent them because they had to read the Torah, and they had to participate in this religious observances. And if you think about throughout history, we were almost the only group, certainly religious group, that made the children, the boys especially, which was okay, read. And when you're literate and when education is important, you advance. And then, of course, the other thing that was interesting that I had read about was during the Middle Ages and all throughout history, in the Jewish community, it was a very important thing to have, to be an intellectual, to be a Torah scholar, to be, and the whole community would support these religious endeavors. What happened? And then they would marry off the guy to the wealthiest man in the community would have a daughter, they'd marry them off, they'd have good kids, they'd be intelligent, what happened in the Christian culture, the Catholic Church, any extra boys would go to the church, the intelligent ones would go to the church, they wouldn't have children, they wouldn't be married off. So we kind of enriched our culture by marrying these intelligent men with these healthy, well-fed women. And really, if you think about it, over time, over hundreds of years, this was our culture. Even in poor communities, it was still our culture. And when you think about it, how is it that today we have so many intelligent Nobel Prize winners? Not everybody, of course, but if you think about it, it is a cultural Jewish thing. And it's not funny. It's really a true thing.
Yeah,
So
it's not only is it cultural though, but you're right, it's become genetic. There's actually some studies that show some intellectual attributes are more common among Jews.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And you think
we have bred our people according to those
and then
values.
that's right. And then you combine that with an environment of education and health. You know, I mean, even if you think about the
Nurture
kosher,
versus nature.
well, if you think about the kosher laws, I mean, it was about cleanliness and eating healthy foods. I don't mean healthy I mean, sanitary foods are definitely not always healthy, but sanitary foods, right? You have to wash, you have to make sure the animal's clean. You know, all of these things really led to a point where we, you know, where things got better for us, even though all around us, things were always getting worse for us. So back to resiliency, I guess. But anyway, very interesting.